Greetings in the name of Christ. My name is Janet Douglas and I'm your pulpit leader for today. I'm glad you've chosen to listen into the set gospel lesson of the day and to this message. And I'm glad too that even in these difficult and unusual circumstances, we are still able to gather, even if it's only remotely. I know it's especially hard for you all at this time as you are between pastoral leadership, and I want you to be assured that you are in my prayers. We all know the followers of Jesus have, together over the centuries, been through some very difficult times, whether it's health crises or wars or political upheavals, famines, droughts, natural disasters, and in all of these unknowables, what we know is that the God's faithful have lived through. We know that with Jesus, our example, and God as the head of this household of faith and humanity, and the Holy Spirit to encourage us and provoke us to do our part, we have prevailed. We are stronger together. And so as we gather, not 2 or 3 in one place, but several of us remotely in cyberspace, we still welcome Jesus into our presence. And we hear these words from the Gospel of John, which is the set lesson for today. Now, the reading is very long, and so I'm going to omit a few verses, but you can, and I hope you will, read all of it. It's in John chapter 9, and it's verses 1 through 41. As Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, was that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." And after saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbours brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now, the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" So they were divided. They didn't believe that he'd been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" "We know he's our son," the parents answered, "and we know he was born blind, but how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself." Now his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. A second time the leaders summoned the man who'd been blind. "Give glory to God by telling the truth," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." He replied, "Whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I've told you already, and you did not listen." And then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Well, that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Jesus heard they'd thrown him out, and when he found him, Jesus said, I have come into the world so that the blind will see. The last time I was your pulpit leader, I talked about this fourth gospel and John's use of signs as pointers to the true identity of Jesus. The writer of John's gospel includes fewer miracle stories than the other gospels, but those he included were especially significant for revealing the nature of Jesus. So it's this emphasis on signs that makes this gospel so different from Matthew, Mark and Luke. Now we have stories of healings and even healings of blind people in those other gospels. But there are some differences. And the most obvious being, Jesus did what? There's a reason Sunday school teachers don't usually use this particular story about the healing of a blind man, and it's the spittle. Now, there's a DVD study course that I've done a number of times with people in a local church, and there's one part of it which we all enjoy a great deal. There's a Church of Christ bishop called Yvette Flunder, and Yvette Flunder grew up in a Southern Baptist church. And in her church, one of the things everyone did is they would listen to the radio to the Bible Answer Man. And the whole point of this particular radio show was people could write in their questions and the Bible Answer Man always had an answer. There was always one answer for every question. And so she would carry around a big fat Bible full of papers with the answers to all the questions, just in case someone asked her the question, because she had the one answer. And then as she's speaking this DVD, she says, but you know what? The older I get, it seems the less I know. And then she laughs heartily. The thing is, there was a time when preachers and teachers had to have an answer to every question. But there are simply things we don't know. I want to be honest with you and tell you there are things in the Bible we just don't necessarily understand or fully understand, despite people who write books about them. Sometimes it's because things have changed, societal norms have changed, expectations have changed, cultures have changed. Sometimes it's because the languages of our Bible, the Hebrew and the Greek the Bible's written in, those have changed. And sometimes it's because our translations have kind of muddied what that might have meant even further. And so we start with these kind of problems. So apart from some very brief comments in a Roman historian's account that the spittle of a fasting man brings efficacious healing, we don't know why Jesus did that whole thing with the spit and the mud. But it's okay. And it's okay because that's not what matters in this story. In John's Gospel, in every one of his signs in his stories, there are multiple layers of meanings, which is great for preachers because we have all kinds of things that we can talk about from these same stories that we hear again and again. So I'm going to talk about just one aspect today because I think it's very relevant to where we are. Jesus, we read, opens the eyes of a man born blind. And among several discussions that are started there, there's one with the authorities of the Jewish faith. Now, don't be sidetracked by this story, which in many translations will speak of the Jews, as if all of them are against Jesus. Now, in last week's gospel set lesson, what we had was Jesus meeting the woman at the well, in which he is acknowledged as a Jew himself, as he was. So the negative sounding comments that you often read about the Jews, particularly in this gospel and sometimes in Luke's gospel, should not be taken as a condemnation of all the Jews. We're really talking about a faction, and really only a faction of the leadership. We know that Jesus himself was very popular with regular Jews. So there's a faction within the hierarchy who are having a problem with Jesus. And the reason is clear in this particular reading. Jesus they see as a rule breaker, and they don't like it. Years ago, I met one of your pastors at a downtown clergy fellowship. And she told me she'd just been looking through some of the books of this congregation, and she'd found some books from the early 1800s which listed people by name and why they'd been dismissed from the church, listing their sin against their name. And I mentioned I'd just done exactly the same down at the Methodist Church downtown. And then we both laughed because it was just, we just had both had the same experience of seeing a church taking this very literally. You see, it wasn't just the Jews who got tied up in this legalism. Well, the religious authorities take exception to what Jesus has done. And once they cannot deny that this man was blind from birth, attested to everyone, including his parents, they have a rule problem. Jesus has healed once again on a Sabbath. They cannot see the miraculous gift of sight because they cannot get past a legal requirement that no work, which includes healing, is done on a Sabbath. So they call Jesus a sinner and say he cannot therefore be doing God's work because he's sinning. And they throw out the healed man who'd only come to them in obedience to the same law to show he'd been healed. They disbar this healed man from the only community he had ever known, the only community he'd ever belonged to. And the reason that the author of John's Gospel wants us to know something about this sign is that this Gospel was being put together at the very time when people who were Jewish Jesus followers were also being cast out from the Jewish community. These Jesus followers of Jesus, who'd been partially tolerated as a Jewish sect within Judaism, as follower of a particular rabbi, were now being thrown out because of their insistence that Jesus was their Lord, that Jesus was God's Messiah, and that therefore his own people had been complicit in killing the one sent from Almighty God. And that was more than the leadership could bear. So Jesus' Jewish followers found themselves disowned, disavowed from the Jewish faith, cast out from the community, separated from worship, the traditions, the lifestyle of their families, going back, it seemed, to the dawn of time. They were no longer people of God. They no longer walked in the path of Abraham and Moses and David. They were no longer part of God's chosen people. This was a trauma we can barely imagine for those who'd been cast out. So the blind man saw the light which runs through John's Gospel right from verse 1, and he sees Jesus for the one he is. And now he needs a new community. The Jesus-following Jews who were thrown out of Jerusalem because they had seen the light about Jesus needed a new community. And that community is what became the church and why we are here today. I've told you before how this era of faith is one that truly fascinates me, and it's where I do all my research. This idea that this period between the death of Jesus and the time when Christianity became the accepted faith of the Roman Empire, almost 300 years later, is enthralling to me. In a time without TV and newspapers and Facebook and telephones and all the things we use today to spread our stories, how did this story of an obscure working man from an obscure part of an obscure small nation ever make it to be the person who was worshipped around a whole empire, the whole known world of the day. It travelled, of course, at first around the Mediterranean Sea in the mouths of travellers and disciples and ordinary people, converts anxious to tell people what it was they knew. Well, that is a miracle indeed. And one done by these ordinary people with nothing more than the power of their convictions and by the power of their actions. These were people not just talking about that faith. Faith was still pretty fluid. There were no written gospels for the first 40 years, and what the people had was a sense of conviction about who Jesus was for them, who he was personally for them. And then they had their actions, because they lived their life according to what they had heard was the nature, the words, the ministry, the character of Jesus. And that was world-changing. How this happened village by village is what fascinates me, because if it worked then, maybe it would work today. In a society where people do not seem to understand why we need to bother having churches at all. And everything I read, and because I love history, points me in one direction. St. Paul travelled from city to city with his message. It was in those cities that Christianity took hold, took shape, and history tells us what those cities were like. The cities were multi-ethnic and they were crowded, filled with poor people who no longer had land, looking for a place to earn some money. They'd arrived in the cities looking for work. Most people lived in multi-floor buildings, and if you had money, you lived on the top floor because the streets were narrow and very dirty and filled with refuse of all kind, animal dung and even human waste. The bottom of the buildings often had small stores. It's there that Paul would have sat plying his trade as a tent maker and telling stories of Jesus. Now, the majority of the working people didn't live in those beautiful stone buildings that we still have little glimpses of around the Roman Empire, but lived in wooden tenements in other parts of the city. And these tenements were very, very close together and very dangerous. Very often they had no windows. And historians tell us that at night, people were often woken by alarms as people were told to run because areas of the cities would burn because the houses were so close together. It was very dangerous. It was dangerous because of disease. It was dangerous because of the living conditions. So what with disease and fires and poor nutrition, some estimates of the lifespan of somebody from the country arriving in the city to find work as being only 3 to 5 years after arriving in the city. And remember, these newcomers came alone. They had no support system. They came without their family. They had no one. And into this, Paul created communities of caring, sharing people. Communities that were completely inclusive. It didn't matter whether you were male or female, young or old, rich or poor, Jewish or Gentile, part of a family, or whether you came alone. It didn't matter where you came from, what your ethnicity was. The message was surprisingly simple. If you're hungry, come. We've food to share, and we'll share it with you. If you're lonely, come. We are family for you. We'll call you brother or sister. We will be your family. And it worked. It worked surprisingly well. It made the Christian world that we know today. I see no other evidence for what attracted people to this strange new faith, this new sect. At first that was part of Judaism, but now had been cast out even from that ancient tradition. The theology, what they talked about God and Jesus, had not yet been set. There was no central organisation to decide on creeds. The Bible itself was not put together, and the Gospels were very new. Even if people had seen a copy of one of those proto-Gospels, very few people could have read it. The people were attracted by the people who already believed in Jesus. And Jesus came so the blind would see. And what people saw were people living out of the Jewish tradition of welcoming in the stranger and the bereft to feed them and more. They welcomed in everyone and shared with everyone as if they were family. This was a community of the extremely generous and the ultra-inclusive. It is an inspiration and a warning to congregations today. We need to be generous to all and welcoming to all. It will show itself in our ability to understand the emotional turmoil many of our friends are in our willingness to listen to their fears, and our ability to love, no matter what. Last time I spoke to you about how you can't be a Christian in isolation, which is rather ironic given that we are now all in isolation. But of course I was referring to the idea that challenges that I don't need to be part of a church to be a Christian kind of sentiment. I continue to challenge that sentiment. This is a corporate faith, and we need our faith community now more than ever. And even though we cannot gather, we can and must use every tool, and we're in a fortunate age for that, to remain in contact. If you feel inspired to use the extra time you have with your travel curtailed and your social calendar emptied to be a part of a telephone calling ministry so that everyone gets to hear a human voice, it's a bit like a prayer chain, but everyone's included. This can help make sure that we're checking in on each other. If you feel inspired to have an online prayer group or Bible study, there are ways to do that. This is a time for us to get creative and groundbreaking as groundbreaking as people were in the early church, and just as dedicated to making community happen. I urge you to be in contact and to brainstorm what you can do to keep in touch, perhaps to make contact with those you've not seen in worship for a while, and to look ahead to what will happen once our isolation ends. Like the man born blind, in our gospel today, we too are feeling we are no longer in touch with our community and our family of faithful friends, but at no point in history has it been this easy to stay in touch, even when we cannot visit and we cannot get to worship. Made in the image of a creative God, we are creative people. Made in the image of a loving God, we are a loving people. Let us use this time to reassess our changed and changing church and social landscape and ask God's guidance as we move forward together into the future. Let us remember our strength has always been our willingness to welcome all, to love all, to care for all, and no matter where we go, God is already there to welcome, bless, and uphold us. God bless you all. Amen.